Welcome back to sqadia.com. My name is Muhammad Osama, and today we are talking about inflammation. Now, this specific lecture is about the acute inflammation and the types of inflammatory cells that are involved in this acute inflammatory process. In addition to the acute inflammation, we are going to talk about the adhesion molecules which are involved in the inflammatory process, the vasoactive changes that occur during the acute inflammation, and the different type of inflammatory cells that take part in the acute inflammatory process. So let's talk about the acute inflammation. Acute inflammation is actually the immediate vascular response of the tissue to any type of noxious or harmful stimuli. That stimuli can be in the form of infection or a physical injury, or as we discussed, it can be autoimmune as well, or it can be simply due to ischemia or any other factor. So any factor can result in acute inflammation, and the immediate response is actually the acute inflammation. And it involves a lot of different type of cells. Here you can see in this picture as well, but we are not going to talk about them here because we are going to talk them about these WBCs or different type of leukocytes in detail in the next slides. So let's start off with the adhesion molecules which are involved in the acute inflammatory process. So there are three major types or groups of adhesion molecules. One are the selectins, one is the immunoglobulin family adhesion proteins, and one are the integrins. So let's start off with the selectins. So selectins are a group of adhesion molecules which are induced by cytokines, which are interleukin 1 and tumor necrosis factor. There are three major types of selectin adhesion molecules, which is the L-selectins, E-selectins, and P-selectins. So as the name suggests, adhesion molecules, these are actually used to adhere to different cells or particles or molecules together with each other. So L-selectins are those type of adhesion molecules which are actually expressed on the neutrophils, which are a type of WBCs, and they are used to adhere them or bind them to the endothelial mucin-like molecules. The second one are the E-selectins, which are expressed on the endothelial cells, and they bind to the oligosaccharides on the leukocytes, which are WBCs. And then there are the P-selectins, which are stored in the endothelial Weber pallid bodies, and they bind them with the platelet alpha granules. Now, the second family is the immunoglobulin family adhesion proteins. So there are, for example, interstitial cell adhesion molecules, which are of two types, 1 and 2, and vascular cell adhesion molecules, which are expressed on the endothelial cells, which are making the lining of the blood vessels, and bind them to integrin molecules on leukocytes or white blood cells. And integrins are exactly the opposite of the immunoglobulin family adhesion proteins because they are present on the leukocytes and they bind them to the endothelial cells. And we will understand the importance of these adhesion molecules as we look into the further parts and processes of the acute inflammation. So vasoactive changes, it's very important because as we said that it is basically the vascular response. So how does this vasoactive changes, or what are the vasoactive changes that occur due to the inflammation or during the inflammatory process? It starts off with the vasoconstriction, which is that the lumen of the blood vessels decrease in size, which is followed shortly in a very short amount of time by vasodilation, which is the increase in the lumen of the blood vessels. This increase in the lumen of the blood vessels results in an increase in the blood flow to the affected or the inflamed area. And at the end, because there is a greater amount of blood coming into that area, so obviously there is redness and warmth in the affected area, which are two very important cardinal signs of inflammation as well. The other changes include the increase in capillary permeability, which allows different molecules to pass from the lumen of the blood vessels to the interstitial fluid. So it is caused by the endothelial changes, which are actually the lining of the blood vessels. What happens is that there is the contraction of the endothelial cells in post-capillary venules. These are the small venules which are formed by the joining of different capillaries. This contraction of endothelial cells leads to widening of the inner endothelial gaps, which are actually the intercellular spaces between these endothelial cells. And as these gaps increase, it results in a major endothelial damage. Why? Because increase in these gaps results in a failure of the function of the endothelium. And what is the function? To keep the contents inside the lumen, which it is no longer able to carry out, because different type of cells and materials can now pass through these intercellular gaps. And as mentioned here, these gaps lead to leakage of proteinaceous fluid out of the lumen into the tissue, or the inflamed tissue or the active tissue, that results in the swelling and edema, which is an important cardinal sign of inflammation, as we discussed earlier. Now, during the acute inflammatory process, as we looked at in the first figure, we saw that there were a lot of cells that were present there, and those are actually the inflammatory cells, or the leukocytes and WBCs. But we need to understand what are the different types of cells and how they perform their function in the acute inflammatory process. So here is a diagram of different types of cells which are involved in the inflammatory process. Here is the platelets, the neutrophils, the macrophages and monocytes, the basophils, eosinophils, lymphocytes, and mast cells. So let's start off with these cells and take a look at their pictures as well. So neutrophils, as you can see here, these are the neutrophils. So neutrophils are the most important cells in the first 24 hours of the acute inflammation, because they are the major part of the WBCs that is actually present in the inflamed tissue during the first response, or the first 24 hours. So what are the causes of neutrophilia? Neutrophilia means an increase in the number of neutrophils. So the causes of neutrophilia include bacterial infection and infarction, etc. Infarction means because of the tissue damage, because of the loss of blood supply. Now, they are released into the blood from bone marrow, post-mitotic reserve pool, and increase in less mature cells such as band neutrophils is observed during the process of acute inflammation. The second type of inflammatory cells are the monocytes, also known as macrophages. So they are the most predominantly found in the acute inflammation after 2 to 3 days after the onset of the inflammatory process. What is the function of monocytes and macrophages? It is very important because they are the cells which are responsible for phagocytosis and engulfing the large particles. These cells have the capacity to live longer and can even divide and proliferate. The cause of monocytosis is actually the increase in the number of monocytes, include tuberculosis, brucellosis, typhus, and salmonella infections. The third type of cells that we're going to talk about are the lymphocytes. So they are most important cells in viral infections, along with monocytes and plasma cells. Monocytes are actually those macrophages that we just talked about in the previous slide. And these are most prominent, especially in chronic inflammation as well. Lymphocytosis, or increase in the lymphocytes, is actually caused by influenza, mumps, rubella, and bacterial infections as well, such as whooping cough and tuberculosis. Eosinophils are prominent type of inflammatory cells which are found in cases of allergic reactions and parasitic infections. The cause of eosinophilia include allergies such as asthma, hay fever, hives, and different types of parasitic infections. Now, mast cells and basophils are another type of inflammatory cells which actually produce histamine, and histamine is a very important chemical which is involved in the process of inflammation. The causes of basophilia, which is the increase in the basophils, include chronic myelogenous leukemia and other myeloproliferative disorders. So, in this part of the inflammation, we talked about the acute inflammation, in which we talked about the adhesion molecules, the vasoactive changes during the acute inflammation, and the different type of inflammatory cells which are involved in the acute inflammation. Even though the acute inflammation topic is not covered completely, we are going to continue it in the next part. So please stay tuned and keep on watching sqadia.com. Thank you.